longtime trade lawyer Mark Warner. Mark, thanks very much for being with us. What does the retaliation plan, in your estimation, look like?
So under the terms of the agreement that we signed between Canada and the United States in order to have the tariffs lifted in the first place, Canada is restricted to only retaliate on products containing aluminum, whatever that is. Is that broad or narrow or however you define that? The government, in the lead up to the reimposition of the tariffs, we've had a bit of conflicting words from the government as to what they would do. The chief negotiator tended to focus in his comments in Parliament on goods that actually contain aluminum, whereas our ambassador to the United States, in some public comments that she's made, has said that Canada wouldn't feel constrained to retaliate only on aluminum. The idea is that if the United States has breached the agreement by imposing tariffs inappropriately, then Canada wouldn't feel bound to retaliate within the constraints of that agreement.
All right, so I'm trying to make sense of what you're saying because, the last report said this is just all politics. And I guess in political circles, for Canada to talk tough back to the United States, there's certainly some who will, like to see that. Maybe there's a few, political gains to be made on that front. But we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're worried about economic costs of living, whether we're individuals or we're businesses. It's not quite sure what a tit for tat means for, those costs. And the government's been quite sensitive to that. So do you think maybe it's a combination of, firing back, but also trying to use the courts to keep the U.S. at bay?
So, I think that is kind of an interesting idea that, what they could do, but it doesn't sound like they're going to do, I think, is they could say, well, first thing we're going to do is go to the American courts. We'll try to challenge it. There have been some interesting decisions in the United States recently that suggest that the president has abused his authority under what's called Section 232 in readjusting some of these national security tariffs. That's kind of different, I think, than this context, but at least you could gum it up in the courts a little bit to push this out beyond the November election if you wanted to. But the quickness of the response from the Deputy Prime Minister and from the real Prime Minister yesterday suggests that they are going to retaliate. Realistically, when we talk about retaliation, it feels good, right? Because it sounds like we're going to hit the other guy. But a retaliatory tariff on American products means that we in Canada, who are importing those products, are going to pay more for them, whether they are cans or whether they're going to be wines or Kentucky bourbon. We tackled that one last time. So it's unless you can retaliate at a scale that can force the other guy to change his or her position, then retaliation is just self-harm. But in a minority parliament, I guess various forms of self-harm are worse than others.
Fair point. On this issue of flooding the American market with Canadian aluminum, we heard a little bit about that in the lead up to your segment. Is that happening? If we're in the court arguing this, what would you say?
So the tricky part of it is say I thought that the president set out 3 executive orders yesterday, 2 with respect to China and essentially 1 with respect to Canada on a different issue, on this aluminum issue. Of all those 3, I thought the aluminum one was the one that was drafted in the best way. He actually did lay out. He said, look, we can see that there's something called unalloyed aluminum, which is to say aluminum that's not mixed or that would have been with other kinds of metals that might be used for specialty products. And he was able to demonstrate some numbers. I haven't checked the numbers, but the numbers are in the executive order to suggest that there's been a massive increase. Now, some of that, I think, has to do with COVID. Essentially, when the advanced manufacturing facilities shut down in the beginning of the year, there was no need to keep sending across the border the specialty aluminum. I think our aluminum producers shifted back more into the regular aluminum, unalloyed aluminum, and so you could see that there was an increase. Part of the problem with that agreement, and I think I flagged this at the time when I was talking on BNN Bloomberg, was that there was no definition for the surge. And so basically it's going to be very hard to win in court about anything like that because Trump is going to say, I see an increase. We told the Canadians, that we retained the right to do this. So that's kind of what it is. I mean, I think, we're part of the U.S. Defense establishment, national security establishment. So in some sense, taking Canada out of it, out of the American aluminum production, seems unfair to us, and it is unfair to us. But on the other hand, if you're an American president and you're trying to reestablish production of aluminum in the United States, and you want to use trade measures, whether that's good or bad, it's hard to do that without striking at Canadian production, simply because we are the biggest exporter of aluminum to them. Anyway, that's kind of, I think, what's going on there. But so I think at the end of the day, I mean, could we swallow the 10% and keep selling to the United States? The truth of the matter is, I think we could. But I think domestically, in terms of the domestic audience, I think there's probably going to be an appetite to see the government look like it's striking back. The hope is that you then don't get in a tit-for-tat battle, because there's always steel, and there were 25% tariffs on steel. So we retaliate on aluminum. We think we've seen Trump before. Does he come back and then say, okay, Canada, you've retaliated, here's what I'm going to do. I'm now going to reimpose the 25% tariffs on steel. And then what do? Have another dollar-for-dollar tit-for-tat war? Generally speaking, the smaller country can't win that kind of war. It feels good, though.
Right. Okay, so we've only got about 30 seconds left, but I feel like what has been missed in part of this, if we're looking at the business of aluminum, is the production out of a country like China these days, which is a factor in ultimately what happens with the buying and selling in North America. Does the Canadian government at all have to sort of think about their wording and how they deal with this, given China's role in the aluminum market and given the fact that we've got a whole bunch of other issues that we're dealing with when it comes to China, and a lot of them are actually tied back to the United States in our last 30 seconds here?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. Obviously, a more global settlement at the OECD or somewhere else that looks at the overcapacity generally is, I think, the general Canadian approach. This probably won't get tied up into the American-U.S.-China dispute. There's always issues of tracing and all of that. That's tended to be more our own producers who are concerned about some competing with Chinese aluminum that might be in Mexico. But I think this is just a straight-out Canada-U.S. play, and really the question at this time is actually more Russia than China, because there's a new production facility coming on board in Kentucky, home of Kentucky bourbon, which has a Russian oligarch as a part owner. And it's that company that has actually asked for these new tariffs as opposed to the rest of the American industry. And that's really what's causing this particular spat.
Boy, you're making my head spin here on a Friday morning, Mr. Warner, but it's important stuff to consider as we think about all these moving parts. Mark Warner joining us.